This will be the second video of the economic growth mini-series, which is part of the Government Macroeconomic Objectives series. This is Unit 2.3 of the IB Economics syllabus. These are the learning outcomes, but I'm going to be explaining each learning outcome as I'm explaining it on its relevant slide. So let's continue. This video will focus primarily on the causes of economic growth. So the first learning outcome is describe, using a PPC, a production possibilities diagram, economic growth as an increase in actual output caused by factors including a reduction in unemployment and increases in productive efficiency, leading to a movement of a point inside the PPC to a point closer to the PPC. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. The learning outcome taken from the IB syllabus actually explains what you need to know. So there are two types of economic growth. There's economic growth, which is an increase in actual output, and there's economic growth as an increase in potential output. The second type, the increase in potential output, I'll talk about in the coming slides. But economic growth as an increase in actual output is caused by either a reduction in unemployment, so you have more of your unemployed resources put to work, or an increase in productive efficiency. Now, what does that look like on a PPC? Essentially, if a country is operating at point B and there's an increase in employment, so a reduction in unemployment, or an increase in technology, or an increase in productive efficiency, that moves the country to a point closer to the PPC, we say that this is economic growth as an increase in actual output. Okay? So if the country is operating within its PPC but moves closer to the PPC, that's an increase in actual output, and this is a type of economic growth. Now, what about economic growth as an increase in potential output? So let's have a look at the learning outcome. It says, describe, using a PPC diagram, economic growth as an increase in the production possibilities caused by factors including increases in the quantity and quality of resources leading to outward PPC shifts. Here, economic growth is an increase in potential output, or in the productive capacity or the production possibilities available to a country. This is economic growth that is caused by an increase in either the quantity of factors of production or the quality of factors of production, or both. And this economic growth, when represented diagrammatically, it causes a shift of the whole PPC outward. So this is economic growth as an increase in production possibilities or an increase in potential output. This is long-run economic growth. While the previous slide, which is the movement from inside the PPC to a closer point on the closer to the PPC, that's short-run economic growth. So remember, economic growth can be an increase in actual output, which leads to a movement from inside the PPC closer to the border of the PPC, or an increase in potential output, which is long-run economic growth, where the whole PPC shifts outwards. Now, what about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagrams? Let's have a look at both of these types of economic growth using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. So short-run economic growth, which is an increase in actual output, could be caused by either an increase in aggregate demand or a positive supply shock, an increase in short-run aggregate supply. As you can see here, an increase in aggregate demand will increase output. This is short-run economic growth. This is an increase in actual output. Because the economy was operating at Y, now it will operate at Y1. So you can see there's been economic growth. Or if there's a positive supply shock that shifts the SRS curve from SRAS to SRAS1, you can see that also causes an increase in output. This is short-run economic growth. It is similar to moving from one point inside to another point closer to the PPC. So it's similar to this that we saw about 2 slides ago, this diagram right here. Okay, so you can represent short-run economic growth using a PPC where the country moves from one point inside to a point closer to the PPC, or using an ADAS diagram where either the aggregate demand curve shifts to the right if the economic growth is driven primarily by increases in aggregate demand, or the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right if the economic growth is driven primarily by a positive supply shock. This brings us to our next learning outcome, which says describing using an LRAS diagram economic growth as an increase in potential output caused by factors including increases in the quantity and quality of resources, leading to a rightward shift of the LRAS curve. And here, this is the long-run economic growth that we saw 2 slides ago, where the PPC shifted outward. So, economic growth as an increase in potential output, or long-run economic growth, causes the PPC to shift outward, as we saw previously. How do you represent that on an ADAS diagram? Well, basically, the long-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, this is long-run economic growth, and it's caused by an increase in the quantity and or quality of the factors of production, maybe the discovery of new natural resources or improvements in technology. Okay, this is caused by an increase in the potential output or the productive capacity of the economy. It's very important to distinguish between short-run economic growth and long-run economic growth, between economic growth that is primarily demand-driven, economic growth that is primarily supply-driven, between economic growth as an increase in actual output versus economic growth as an increase in potential output. Now, the next 2 learning outcomes, which I'm going to combine, explain the importance of investment for economic growth, referring to investment in physical capital, human capital, and natural capital, and explain the importance of improved productivity for economic growth. So basically, investment is one of the biggest drivers of economic growth. Investment in all 3 types of capital. Physical capital, such as investment in building new machinery, building new roads, highways, new buildings. Human capital, investment in the education and the healthcare of your workforce. So investing in making your workforce healthier and more educated. And investment in natural capital, such as building conservationist parks to look after natural resources and so on. Essentially, investment in any type of capital, the whole idea is it increases productivity either in the short run or the long run. This increased productivity will eventually increase the economy's productive capacity and its potential output. Okay? And this will cause an increase in the quantity and or quality of resources, which, guess what, ladies and gentlemen, as we explained earlier, all causes economic growth. So remember, investment in capital, whether it's natural capital, physical capital, or human capital, should eventually increase productivity and lead to an increase in the quantity and or quality of resources and an increase in the economy's productive capacity, all of which leads to economic growth. So it's important to understand that investment and working to improve productivity are important drivers of economic growth, whether short-run or long-run economic growth. Now, just to wrap up, so the causes of economic growth, which is the focus of this video, are reduction in unemployment, putting more of your unemployed factors of production to work. This will cause short-run economic growth. It will cause an increase in actual output, and the country will move from a point inside the PPC to a point closer to the PPC. Increase in productive efficiency, which will also cause a move from one point inside the PPC closer to the PPC, is another cause of economic growth. Number 3, increase in the quantity and or quality of resources, which will cause long-run economic growth and shift the PPC outward or shift the long-run aggregate supply curve outward. Investment can trigger all 3 causes of economic growth, and this is why investment and working to increase productivity is very important for the goal of achieving economic growth. That's why governments are committed to investing in human capital, natural capital, and physical capital, and are committed to investing in supply-side policies, implementing supply-side policies to improve productivity. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.